Hello guys, so let's go ahead and take a look at the bones and bony landmarks as well as the joints of the pelvis and the hip complex here. So first, let's take a look at the actual femur here. So here we go, we have our femur, and very similar to the humerus of our body, we see some very commonalities between them. So one, this is the head of our femur. So there is a big extension from the head to the rest of the femur. So just as our body, our head, extends from our body through our neck, well, so does the femur. The femur here has what we call the anatomical neck of the femur. So here's the head of the femur, and then here's the neck connecting it to the rest of the body of the femur. The next landmarks we're going to look at is this big bump right here. So if you actually put your hand on your hip, you'd feel this big bone on the side of your hip, and this is what we call the greater trochanter. So remember that we wouldn't be so extra in explaining that this is the greater trochanter if it didn't have a component or counterpart, or what we would call the lesser trochanter. So right here, the lesser trochanter is actually on the inside or medial side of your femur here, of your body. So then, of course, just like every other long bone, we do have the shaft. The shaft is this big, long, central portion of the bone. But on the shaft, we're looking at a particular line. So you can actually see, I know this picture is a little grainy, but you can see this line running straight down the shaft of the posterior aspect. This is the posterior femur right here. On the back of the femur is a line, or what we call the linea aspera. So if you remember back to the muscles and structures on the spine and thorax, we looked at the linea alba. Well, this is the second line that we have in the body, the linea aspera. So moving down to the distal portion of the femur, we're going to see the few surfaces here. So again, commonalities between this and the humerus itself, we have condyles. So one, we have the lateral condyles right here, and then we have the medial condyles as well. So this is the medial side of the femur. So very similar to the humerus here, we got those condyles just like we would on the humerus. Now we do exactly, this is going to bring us into our next thing, is what exactly is the patella? Well, the patella is the bone that is in our knee. So if we touch our kneecap, our patella is our kneecap. Our kneecap is that big bone, and that helps with the articulation of the knee joint here, which we'll see later on. So the patella is what we call a sesamoid bone, and it grows, which means sesamoid bones grow inside tendons of other muscles. So the sesamoid bone, or patella, is the bone that is the kneecap there. So let's go ahead and take a look at the bones of the pelvis. So we're going to look at three different views of the pelvis. One, this is our lateral view. Right here, we're looking at the anterior view, and then, excuse me, actually this is the posterior view, and then lastly this is the anterior view. So this is the front of the pelvis, this is the back of the pelvis, and then this is the side of the pelvis here. So thank you for the picture here that I took from the internet. Don't come after me, don't sue me, but I'll hopefully maybe put a link for your stuff in there for all of the pictures that we are going to see today. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the landmarks on the front of the pelvis here. So one, let's look at the three regions of the pelvis. There's three major regions of the pelvis, and we can actually clearly see that on this lateral view here. So one, we have this margin, which is up here, and you can see it actually already identified out, marked as the ilium. So this is the ilium of the pelvis. Then we have, then down here, no, can switch my colors. And then lastly, we have another region right here called the pubis. So those are the three regions of the pelvis. We have the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So the ilium is the big wings that is your hips. So if you put your hands on your hips and then you dip, we dip, we dip, that is the ilium. The ischium is what you're probably sitting on right now while watching this video. And then the pubis, well, we can all kind of see the association of what that would be. So let's look at the landmarks specific to each part of the regions of the pelvis. So first, let's look at the area in which all of these muscles, or excuse me, all of these bones meet, which is right here, this big socket, this big depression, or what we call the acetabulum, as depicted right here, or some people pronounce it the acetabulum. The acetabulum right here is actually where all three parts of the pelvis meet. So if I were to divide it like that, these are where all three parts of the pelvis meet. It kind of makes this little cross-hatch pattern here. So the acetabulum is one of the landmarks that we're going to see making a big joint here in a little bit. Now let's go ahead and break down some of these bones in some specificity here. So first, let's look at the anterior part of the pelvis and look at the ilium. So of the ilium, we have these big crests right here, these big ridges. And so if you put your hands on top of your hips, this is what you're touching. You're touching what's known as the iliac crest. So this is the iliac crest. This is the crest of the ilium. Now, forms this bowl. So in a bowl, right, we know there's a depression in there. We have a bowl, right? Boom, we're going to put the bowl right here. Right here is a depression, a little convexity, just like we would have in a bowl, a little concavity, right? We'd have this little concavity there. This is what we call the iliac fossa. This is the iliac fossa. This is the fossa of the ilium. So now let's look at the posterior part of the ilium. Well, actually, excuse me, I'm sorry, we're not done with the anterior part of the ilium. So coming off of the iliac crest here is this big bump, this little projection. So right here we have what we call the ASIS, or that's acronymed ASIS, which stands for the anterior superior iliac spine. So the anterior superior iliac spine comes off of the iliac crest. Now, the second part here, so we have the anterior superior iliac spine, so that means we have the anterior superior inferior, anterior inferior iliac spine, the AIIS. So anterior inferior and then anterior superior right here. So two spines of the ilium. Now we're good to go and look at the back of the pelvis, the posterior aspect of the pelvis. So again, we see the posterior aspect of the pelvis. We do have the crest again as well. Here's the crest, right? Cavity here, a ridge right here, called the gluteal surface of the ilium. So this is where the glutes will actually attach to. This is the gluteal surface of the Now, anterior superior and anterior inferior spines, we have some on the back. We have the posterior superior and posterior inferior iliac spines. So the PSIS and the PIIS. So I know that's a lot of acronyms. That's a lot of words for you. But try your best to recap and remember those. Now let's take a look at the ischium. The one landmark of the ischium that we're going to look at is where the hamstring's attached to, and that's the ischial tuberosity. So that ischial tuberosity is the landmark of the ischium, so you'd see it down here too. This is what we're sitting on. This is our sits bone, as we call it. This is what we're sitting on when we're talking about taking a seat, or if you take a yoga class, sitting on your sits bones, as they call them. The ischial tuberosity is what you are sitting on, and that's where the hamstrings are going to attach to. Then we're going to look at the pelvis here, or excuse me, the pubis, and there's only one landmark of the pubis, and that's the pubic crest. So this is the top of the pubis. This is the crest of the pubic bones. So the pubic crest. Now, we've already looked at the sacrum when we looked at the spine, so we're not going to look at those landmarks, but you can always review that video if you'd like. But that's going to do it for the bones and bony landmarks. Let's go ahead and take a look at these joints when these bony landmarks come together. So now that we've seen the bones and bony landmarks of the pelvis and thigh here, let's go ahead and put those bones together and form these joints. So we're going to take a top-down approach when looking at these joints, and we're going to start with the joint right here called the lumbosacral joint. So this is the joint between the last lumbar vertebrae, L5, with the sacrum. Now, with this joint, it's mostly just like the other intervertebral joints here, was mostly a shock absorber. And of course, one thing to note was that it had an intervertebral disc. So while there is some movement, there's not enough for us to really pay attention to as massage therapists. So the next joint we're going to look at is right here on the back. We have one on each side. So this is where the sacrum meets the ilium on each side of the pelvis. So we have two sacroiliac joints, which we acronym the SI joints. So the joint does have movement. As we do walk, our hips do kind of shift and do some slight pivoting action, but again, not enough for us as massage therapists to really pay attention to in preparation for that MBLEX. So the sacroiliac joint, the SI joint, formed by the sacrum and the parts of the ilium. Now the next joint we're going to look at is where the sacrum and the coccyx meet, or the sacrococcygeal joint. Now there's definitely no movement here. It is a fused bone or fused joint, but knowing the name is good enough for us. Now the other joint we're going to look at here on the front of the body is what we call the pubic symphysis. This is where the two parts of the pubic bones of each side of the pelvis here meet together. So they're in symphony. They are symphysized. So the pubic symphysis. Now again, some movement does occur here as we do walk, but we're not going to pay attention to much of the movements. The one thing to note about this joint is this piece of cartilage right here in between, which is called the pubic symphysis. So the pubic symphysis joint has a piece of cartilage here called the pubic symphysis. Now the last joint we're going to look at is kind of the big shebang here. So this is going to be the most movable joint that we looked at. All of the joints so far that we've seen, literally we just look at what their names are. And the names are easy because of what parts of the bones come together. So the next one we're going to look at isn't quite as simple. It has several names to go by. Go ahead and just put your arm up there, Dex, get it out the way. So one, we can call this your hip joint. Right? This is the joint that we commonly associate as our hip, that big ball and socket joint. But the other names it can go by is the coxal joint, C-O-X-A-L, coxal joint. Or my preferred name, which is the femoroacetabular joint. The femoroacetabular joint, which that name kind of says it all. Basically, that name is saying that the femur, femoro, is coming to meet the acetabulum, the acetabulum of the pelvis there. So this is the head of the femur articulating with the acetabulum, which is that common meeting point of all parts of the pelvis, which is that big convex concavity, big depression there. So that forms a nice ball and socket joint. So thinking back to like the shoulder joint there, the glenohumeral joint, well, ball and socket joints can pretty much do almost just about every movement. So same thing here with the hip. So obviously we can have flexion, so that's basically we're doing the can-can, flexion, right? And then extension is taking our leg back. So flexion would be us kicking the ball, extension would be us taking our leg back, rearing our leg back, getting ready to kick the ball. So then we can have adduction and abduction. So basically like doing your jumping jacks. If you jump and your feet separate, well, that's abduction for that jumping jack. And then when you jump the feet back in,
your thighs, your hip joint, your coxal joint, your femoroacetabular joint is going to adduct back in. So of course we can do, of course we can also do horizontal adduction and abduction, and we can also do transverse adduction and abduction here. Sorry, Dex isn't as flexible as he used to be in his heyday when he had muscles and skin. So another movement possible at this joint, since we have flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, we obviously also can do rotation. So we can turn the thigh in and turn the thigh out. So we have that internal and external rotation as well. So if our thigh turns in, so basically if our foot were to turn towards the center line of the body, that's internal rotation at the hip, along the whole chain, of course. So if the foot turning in, if it's not just isolated at one joint and it actually transmits all the way into the hip socket itself, is going to turn the hip in, just much like my shoulder. So this internal rotation, external rotation of the hip. And then with all of those movements together, the flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, and rotation, we can then produce that circular movement we've seen before called circumduction. So that's going to do it for the joints and the bones and bony landmarks for us today. So go ahead and stay tuned for the video on the muscles, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.